It's a pleasure to be back. It's a pleasure to see you again. I don't know how many of you were here last time when I came to talk about Beethoven, or how many of you have seen the shows. By a quick show of hands, who plays an instrument who's in the room? Anybody? All right, largely piano or many things? Various things? Piano, lots of things. All right, great. Well, one of the things that is fascinating me about the music of Debussy, in particular, because he really was the change of all music as we know it in Western music, is the question about where things come from. Now, one of the wonderful things about talking at Google and talking to people like yourselves is essentially what you are inventors. You're the Debussys of today. You know, I think about Debussy and I really can't understand where he came up with these ideas that essentially didn't exist before he came up with them. And if we think about that and think of the kind of work that you yourselves are doing, the question I always have with people like yourselves, I mean, you know, me, in terms of inventing, I'm not really an inventor. I'm a recreator, I'm an interpreter, I'm that kind of person. I'm somebody who takes pictures from another world and presents them to the public. But essentially, they've all existed. I give my own taste to the whole thing, perhaps, but nothing more than that. What you guys are doing and what Debussy did is really create something out of nothing. All Debussy had were tools. He essentially had, at that point, he had, you know, the 12 tones of the scale. That's all he had. And he had chord configurations. He had history of, you know, music that came before him, but he didn't look to that music. It's amazing that he picked stuff out of thin air. So conceptually, what I'd like to look at today is this idea of where things come from and how they actually arrive there. How do you guys come up with the ideas that you come up with? Are they just dreams? Did Debussy suddenly close his eyes and say, what does this sound like to me? And how do you create that? In going backwards a little bit, let's think of Beethoven for a second. Here was a man who essentially pushed music so far that he basically did what everybody did, but only after Bach had did it before him. If you think of this with Beethoven, it's really just a few pounding notes. He claimed to have heard this because he was walking through the streets of Vienna. He got tired and he sat down at the foot of a tree. And he couldn't hear anything by this point. It was quite late in his career. Well, not late, it was middle of his career, but his hearing had completely gone. And he claimed that he felt knocking of a bird on a tree. And that's where he came home and interpreted that from. It's a fascinating idea. We understand how he came up with it, where he found it, and then how he developed that and used those 4 notes to continually push further in music. We can look at Bach and understand how he captured essentially all of written music, all of music that we have as an idea, in such simple, you start with the first prelude, you know? This literally sounds like it was composed yesterday. It's that fresh. The voice leading is so perfect. The colors are so perfect. Doesn't matter what instrument you play this on. For those of you who play many instruments, no matter which one you choose, this is eternal music and it will stay. It's miraculous how that happens. Where did these guys come up with this? But all this has a tradition. It comes from point 0 to point A to point B to point C. If we think of following the composers, we can see how each one of them leads to the next guy in some way or other. Beethoven was curious because once he went deaf, I've always wondered this. Once he went deaf, was he able to then self-edit? For instance, all of you guys, whatever it is you put out there on the net or whatever, you're doing it, you're coding, you're working, you're busy preparing, you put it out there for the world, you can go, oh God, that's really bad. That doesn't work at all. I got to take that back. I can't believe my name is attached to it. I got to fix it. Because suddenly when it evolves into public forum, we see it in a very different context. Beethoven, as a composer, never had that ability. He would go into the theater, he would listen to the music, he couldn't hear it at all. He would listen to it in his head. So he was never able to say, oh, that really sounded great. It looked great on paper, but the moment I start to do this in front of the public, it's terrible. The physical reaction is visceral. My idea has always been that he's pushed music so much further because we went with his imagination. Now, Debussy did not have that. The interesting thing about Debussy, he was very, very crotchety. He, in fact, created a character called Monsieur Croche. Now, Croche is, you know, an eighth note in French, but it also means old crotchety one. And he created this character that basically was a critic, and it was his alter ego, and he was not nice to anybody about anything. You know, he could be very nice in public, although he was quite scandalous. But Monsieur Croche was really a terrible guy. Basically, he said, Beethoven, oh, Beethoven, he's just the old deaf one. You imagine. And then he said of Beethoven, he says, the guy has something to say, just poor thing has no means to say it. Mendelssohn, for instance, Debussy said, oh, he's nothing more than a proper accountant. I mean, and this would go on and on. He had enemies in Paris, and it was terrible. But Debussy somehow understood that each one of them contributed something. Debussy's whole goal in art and in music was not to do any of that. It was to create something completely new. He was fed up with rules. He wasn't interested in any of the rules that music came before him. He said there is only one guiding factor in all of music, and that's what pleases the ear. If it's beautiful for the ear, and if it feels like something for the ear, then it's worthwhile, which is the antithesis of what Beethoven did. He couldn't care about what the ear sounds like because he didn't know at that point. He couldn't access it that way. He could imagine, but he couldn't access. So we go back to Debussy, and we have him living in Paris in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. It's a time where the entire world of music is changing. The entire world of art is changing. If you think about Debussy's great influence, there were two of them. One was Turner, the painter. The other was Whistler, the painter. You know, in Whistler's day, and I just read about this the other day, I think it was in the 1870s, he had painted Nocturne in black and gold. It's called The Falling Rocket. It's a wonderful image. You can look this up. It's basically this dark image with these explosions of fireworks in it. And it doesn't look like anything until you stand there and let yourself feel. And it was interesting that the critic Ruskin, who was the major British critic at the time, basically accused him of flinging paint in the face of the public. If you look at it today, it gives us such a sense of emotion, such a sense of feeling. So how did these guys, in particular Debussy, look at the world and say, I don't want to paint what I see in sound. What I see in sound is very simple. It's raindrops, it's this or the other. I want to paint in sound what I feel when I'm actually engaging with nature. So his whole idea was to paint feeling in sound. Now, how do you accomplish that? His whole concept about accomplishing that was actually using color of sound. For instance, I'm using words and so on and so forth. But if I place my voice here and I talk like this, you'll hear something, you'll hear the words. It may be interesting, but it may not necessarily communicate the color that we're looking for. And I mean, you know, yeah, this is somebody from Brooklyn who talks maybe a little bit like this, you know, where I live some of the time. But at the end of the day, if you want to give color of sound and create that beautiful, you know, aura that makes us feel something, you all have to use a color. And color and timbre was so important to Debussy. And to try and explain it, it was a lifetime of trying to understand how sound actually affected the spirit. You know, when we use words, are they the actual words, and this has always been a fascinating idea for me, are the actual words that we put on paper or on our screens, is it their meaning? Or is it the meaning and everything plus the meaning? So is it not just the technical word itself that we are using to express something, to communicate, but it is the cultural and all the rest that is around that word that makes it so fascinating in terms of how we communicate one to the next. So Debussy, he is looking for a way to communicate that's new. He's looking for a way to communicate that's fresh. He's looking for a way to tell new stories. He did some early things, you know, stuff like this. It's so pretty. It just floats, you know, like water. Where did he come up with this water? The blend of sound. Now, this is an early piece of Debussy. He believed that he didn't even begin to touch what one could express in music. Here he sort of thought, well, that's pretty, it's nice, isn't it? It's got this kind of watery color, except nobody was even doing this before that. Somehow that blend of color, that blend of sound that allowed us to feel liquid in water was really remarkable. And it only took about 25 or 30 years from that sound for the Russians to come to Paris and say, we are sick of this water, we are sick of this sound, we are sick of all of these flowing things, now we need to have music. And so, you know, and so of course then you have the Rite of Spring, and all of a sudden Debussy gets pushed to the side with Stravinsky, who thought Debussy was okay, but not really so great, you know. And then we have, you know, all kinds of Russians influencing a whole, so, you know, this goes in cycles, much like the world is, much like we can only hope that the world continues going in cycles. But Debussy, when did he actually change the world of music? Strangely, he changed it with one instrument and with one note. That instrument was a flute, and the note was a C sharp. One note. Now, there are lots of ways to play a C sharp. Or the idea of having the sound that's around the sound. And what I think Debussy understood well was that sound is not just in and of itself a sound. I think what Debussy understood perfectly was sound is created by the sound itself and by the overtones and the aura around it. So when that first flute played, it had to do that. And then for the first time, he tells us where we are, sort of. That magic. So, with these few bars, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bars, Debussy introduced the world to an entire new life in music. Why? The first thing is, up until him, the people who really pushed music, and that he took a little bit from, you had Rimsky-Korsakov in Russia, who was pushing music with chromaticism, making chromaticism kind of sexy. And when Rimsky-Korsakov looked at Debussy's music, he said Debussy has absolutely no talent whatsoever. He has nothing to say, and worse, whatever he does have to say, he doesn't know how to say it. That was him. All right, and then you had also Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky was sent one of Debussy's manuscripts, and Tchaikovsky looked at it and said, you know, for an amateur, it's not bad. You know, it's a few notes here. Yeah, there's a few ideas, but he doesn't develop anything. He doesn't understand. He doesn't. And yet here was a man who pushed everything forth so much. So looking at how and why is the real question. Then we have Wagner. Now, Wagner was a real problem for Debussy. First of all, at the point where Debussy discusses Wagner, his love of his life and his wife, she was first his girlfriend and later his wife, or lady friend and then later his wife, was Emma Bardak, who he stole away from a very rich banker, because that was Debussy's thing. And it sort of was, you know. And so Debussy, now having Emma Bardak in his life, you know, she was Jewish, and Wagner had no patience for that. I mean, this goes back all the way to the mid-1800s, where Wagner, you know, basically said in Das Judentum für die Musik, Jewishness in music, he said, you know, it's paraphrased, but you get the idea. It's, at the end of the day, the only thing that will save you Jews from your curse is being annihilated. You know, and it's interesting. Now, why I bring this up? It's morbid, but it's good. That Judentum in der Musik, the Jewishness in music, actually began with Wagner in 1850. From there, much later, Goebbels and Göring took the basis of what Wagner said and made it the basis for the final solution. Way long after Wagner is dead. But this is what happened, and these are how these things generate. This is how terror generates. This is how annihilation generates. This is how genocide generates. Bad ideas that only get taken on by crazy people and get much, much, much worse and lead to the worst things in the universe. And so here you have Debussy in this crosshairs with Wagner. First of all, he hated his ethic, and he hated his theories about music because they were just so constantly overt and constantly repetitious. And yet at the same time, Debussy stole as much as he could from Wagner to make it work for him. The interesting thing about Debussy and Wagner is at the end, Debussy said of him, he said, well, Wagner, you know, he's basically a sunset that people are mistaking for a dawn. Essentially, that Wagner's time was over, he came, he went, there was nothing more interesting to learn from him. But you see, the thing about Wagner that is really remarkable, that then leads us to Debussy. If we think about something like this, Liebestod, Death and Transfiguration, he goes through keys. Basically, death is transfiguring. This is where she sings, Mil tun leise, wie lichtet. How soft his smile. And you know, basically what's happened by this point is that he's died, he's been killed, and she's standing over his dead body, and she wants to join him in death, because that's the only place that they can be together. And what Wagner does is he takes us through so many keys to get there. And then if that's not enough, we transfigure again. And we keep on transfiguring until we get to here, and so on and so forth. And then, because that wasn't enough, we transfigure some more. We keep on going through keys. Now, the essence of this going through keys, to keep on going this way, was Wagner's approach to telling us about sex. Now, the interesting thing about this is in those days, you know, of course, people were sexually overt. It's not quite like today. It wasn't quite as free, or I don't even know which way it's going. I don't even know what it is today. But in those, it's true. But in those days, you know, to be able to express this kind of sexual and sensual energy in music was of prime importance. How to do that. Wagner's way of getting out all his frustration against the Jews, apparently, was to write these kinds of never-ending, constant turns in music. These cadences that would never resolve. So this idea that the cadence kept on pulling us and pulling us more and more and more. And if you listen carefully to what he does, even just a little bit later in this, he does something like this. And it keeps on going and it keeps on building like this. He never lets us breathe, and that's what he does with musical tension. Wagner figured that out. Debussy then went one step further. He said, okay, now how can I take that, be not as gross, and make it just so sensual and so beautiful to use this kind of never-ending color and use of sound and never be bound to a key. So this all goes back to what I spoke about very early on. The real question in all of this is, when you are inventing something, what are the parameters? Are there parameters? What kind of rules must we abide by so that we actually get to something that can be used, adapted, interesting to the public, something that can be used all over the world, something that can be of interest? Do we invent exclusive of how things are received? Or do we invent with the mind that this is how this is going to be used? It's a question I pose you. Because the question for me when it comes to great music in Debussy, was he creating these colors and these ideas because they just came to him and he didn't care what the public felt? Or this is what it sounded like to him and it was fine, and so invented a completely new world of music? Or was he saying, I have an entire superstructure of how music should go in my head, and he placed the system in order to work? That system, a lot of it based on a whole tone scale. So many of you know the scales, you know, it's as simple as it is, right? But if we keep the whole tones, that means half tones between each. Now, if you play it loud with no ambience, it's just noise. But then you start. Feels a little bit like Fantasy Island. You know, and you speed it up, it gets even more Fantasy Island and so on and so forth. So the idea is, where does this all come from? And that's how I'd like to start our discussion today. This idea about asking questions about this, trying to understand where it comes from, how it works. I will use musical examples, but in order for this to work, you need to ask these questions that are interesting to you. And if we engage together, then I'll be able to answer specifically. So the floor is open. Don't waste time thinking about your question. Just ask. Go ahead. I see you're looking. Ask me a question about something like this. You got to think. All right. Anybody else? A question? Go ahead. That's a very interesting question. So I'll repeat for sound. The gentleman asks, here you have music or sound that has changed over years throughout history, and the reception to it has changed over, you know, there were rules. In the old days, there was no such a thing as this. I mean, you know, the parallel notes, I mean, especially in the very early days, yes, but then as we got into great Western music, putting a parallel, I mean, that was against the rules, completely against the rules. And our ears have adapted to these things in various ways. So the question is, at what point does something like Impressionist music actually take on a pale of ugh, and we don't want it, it's not interesting to us anymore? Well, that's the magic about great music. But here's the thing about Impressionist music. Debussy could not stand the term Impressionism. Basically what he said was, Impressionism is for imbeciles, I can do it for real. Because, you know, this whole idea of Impressionism, it was basically a disparaging term to sort of slough people off. You know, you're not really good at what you do. If you were really good at what you do, you could actually do it within the context of the rules. So anything that you're doing, breaking the rules or softening the edges, means you can't really do it. And so instead of really playing a scale the way it should be played, you're now softening it and mixing it up and doing it. It's because you can't. And Debussy said, it's not because I can't, I very much so can. I can do that. The idea of Impressionism was a term that was used and it stuck. But it really didn't mean anything to Debussy, and I don't think it meant anything to a lot of his compatriots. What they were doing was creating a new method of art and a new method of reaction to art. And so, how do we know if it stays? Well, if we're still doing it 100 years from now, it's going to stay. You know, and that's the other interesting thing about what's great and what isn't. Chopin said, in the early days, he said, somebody was playing a mazurka. He was playing a mazurka for somebody, something like this. And somebody who was sitting there listening to him play this very elegant dance said to him, so is it good? And he said, I don't know, ask me in 100 years. Because it's true, time is really the test for all of this. There's a reason Shakespeare stuck around. And if you look at all this stuff, no matter what you're looking at artistically, you know, we have today, artists put out things. There are critics who say, oh, it's great, it's the greatest thing. Critics say, oh, it's terrible. And Debussy had his share of both of those sides. Most people largely hated what he did. They said it was an abomination to music. For us to think about something so tame as being an abomination to music is really quite remarkable. But at the end of the day, we don't know. The thing that seems to stay, in terms of your question, is if it touches any part of our souls as human beings. If it touches our intellect, of course, there's something there. But if it touches our souls, our sensibilities, just the sense of feeling. And I think feeling is very important. And sometimes I worry that we've lost sense of feeling, especially the way the world is going now, the way people feel to talk to each other. I think, does not anybody feel that there is somebody on the other end? You know, there's a sense of being aware of feeling. And I think people like Debussy, crotchety as he was, difficult as he was, understood what it meant to actually feel something. Even though he couldn't express it to the people in his life, perhaps. As people who knew him said, oh, he was very much in love with himself, and he was in love with his little daughter, completely madly in love with her, and he was in love with his genius. But he understood how people communicated, and he understood how they felt. And certainly when it came to something like Palais et Mélisande, his opera, he understood how people interact. And it's interesting, I know somebody very much like this. Put them in a room, and they can tell you everything about every interaction between the people and how people feel. Ask him how he feels and how he interacts himself. He can't begin to even share it. It's a very interesting thing. I know a director like that. Fascinating to watch him operate. He can look on a script and tell you how every character is supposed to behave to the deepest of their souls. Talk to him, it's like talking to a wall, quite literally. So it's a very interesting kind of thing how that works. I think music like this will stay forever for the simple reason that I think it has the human element. It has a sense of humanity that's not gonna go away. Another question. How do different people react to various influences in music when it comes to music and its cultural relationship? Well, this is very interesting. I was performing the Beethoven in San Diego 3-4 weeks ago, whatever it was. And it was fascinating that somebody took me to task for claiming that, somebody in the audience took me to task during this, for claiming that, in all of Western music, in all of music, nobody had ever composed like this of Beethoven, in all of music. And they accused me of appropriating things. And I said, appropriating what? Well, what about African-American music and Eastern music? And then I thought about that. I said, one could reshape that term and say in the history of Western music. So the interesting thing about Debussy, and this has been, since you bring it up, on my mind very much about what do we react to in terms of because culturally we're sensitized to certain things, is very interesting that a lot of what Debussy drew on were Eastern influences. One of the things, he saw the Javanese gamelan orchestra at the 1889 Paris Exposition for the first time. These were guys, they were the shaved heads, and they were robes, and they were sitting on the floor, gongs and bells and tubes. And nobody ever seen this in the Western world before. And remember, it's not like today, you make a click, you see whatever. And, this idea. Using timbre and color to actually create the sound of the gamelan orchestra. Now, what's interesting here is he uses the pentatonic scale. What's the pentatonic scale? 5 notes. And it's interesting how that sounds Eastern. And he does all these beautiful colors with this. So now I have a question. You have Pagode by Debussy. You have many other pieces by Debussy that use this pentatonic scale, the scale of the East, that was brought to the West by whenever it was presented at the time. So is that cultural appropriation? Or is that homage? And is homage okay? So, in terms of how we react to things, it's very interesting to put Debussy in that box and say, okay, well, did he use all of these Oriental colors? And Oriental doesn't mean Asian in this case. Oriental means really the Orient. It means Russian, all those kinds of colors with the open, weird pentatonic, colors. Did he appropriate that? Or did he find wonderful color in that and translate it into his own art? And does he then owe royalties to wherever he stole it from, and so on? There's so many questions to ask here. But you ask the same question of a guy like George Gershwin. Okay, you have this. So you have that guy. This is clearly a guy who took African-American music and African-American idioms and basically cleaned it up. And by that I don't mean made it pure or holy, basically cleaned it up, and that he put it into a structure so that it could fit into a concert hall. In his day, they said he made a lady out of jazz. Today, I'm not so sure that would be such an easy thing to say or do, because we are looking at it, he basically essentially appropriated what was the blues and put it into his music and created an American music. So can we say of him that that was an homage, or that was outright thievery, or is it right, is it wrong? We're now, I think, coming to the point in the world where we're starting to look at these things very seriously. What belongs to whom? What is allowed to be borrowed? What is not? What's correct? What isn't? And I think these are a lot of questions, and they're important questions. I think for the longest time, whoever was running the business, they said, my rules are the rules. But now we have to look differently. I actually think that's a great thing. But by the same token, in the case of Debussy, the culture that was around him was not prepared necessarily to accept what he was going to give them so freely and so easily. But the artist culture was very much so interested in these new colors that he was opening. And that's a fascinating thing. So in terms of how we react to it culturally, it's like anything. You know, if we're familiar with it, it's easier to accept. If we're not familiar with it, we have to have an open mind and wonder if we can see other and have an emotional reaction to that. You know, we're now becoming a very interesting world because I get to tour a lot and be around and see a lot of people where that is being closed off. Where now what I am is what I am and I'm not interested in anybody else or anything else or any other, I'm not interested in anything. That scares the living daylights out of me. But you know, for some people, that's the only way to live now. So we are, all this, the questions you're asking, it's very important, scary, and at the same time, eye-opening. And in the case of Debussy, you know, will the next generation tell us that all that stuff that he originated is cultural appropriation and we can't listen to it anymore? I was just in Kentucky. I was performing the Irving Berlin piece. And of course, Irving Berlin, you know, was a Russian immigrant, came over in 1888, and no, he was born in 1888. He came over in 1893, saw Lady Liberty, and gave us God Bless America and all the rest. So it's interesting. Over there, the question of Stephen Foster came up. Stephen Foster was Irving Berlin's hero. Basically, he said that the real great American songwriter was Stephen Foster, and he was able to create, you know, based on Stephen Foster's ideology. But now Stephen Foster's coming under tremendous attack. First of all, he'd never been to the South. I think once on a boat, and I don't even think he got off. So that's a fascinating thing. But if you look at the lyrics of Duda and Camptown Ray and all these things, they're much worse than the verses that we sing. They're absolutely dreadful. They're unsingable. And you know, all the blackface and so on and so forth. So the whole question now comes to, is Stephen Foster, do we take all of that music and we say that's not American because it's not an American value? I mean, this is big questions that we have to deal with, and because we have the internet and because so many people can talk to one another, these are questions that we have to deal with, and I think the idea is to deal with them. So in terms of culture, it affects and it affects very, very deeply. Another question, please. Yes? How much being grouchy was allowed Debussy to actually be as creative as he was? Probably a whole lot. I think being miserable, finding a way out of being miserable, this was his way out of being miserable. He went to his art. But it wasn't just that he was grouchy. I think he was an uncomfortable personality. First of all, as a kid, we learned about Debussy that his parents, you know, he was the eldest, they didn't pay much attention to him, so they didn't really care about him at all. Then he finds himself being a pianist. He goes to the conservatoire. They tell him at the conservatoire he doesn't have much talent, and he keeps on trying, he keeps on getting second rate. He then wins, you know, the Prix de Rome in France, and he goes to Italy and studies in Italy and creates in Italy, and he can't stand it there. In fact, he can't stand it anywhere. He's constantly looking for his place. And I think the constantly looking for his place and the way he fits in is why he composes in the colors that he does, because it allows him to create a world of sound and a world of music that makes sense to him, and it's a place for him to live. He can feel comfortable. And I have to tell you, in the world that we're in, you know, I think all of us, we're all looking for what it is we do that allows us to feel safe and allows us to feel whole and allows us not to be frightened and threatened by the world around us. In his case, it's music. In my case, it's this and telling stories. And we're all looking, in your case, it's creating what it is you do every single day. Another question. Yes? Well, what do I think about living in this world where we can do so many things with machines? Well, essentially, this is a machine. It's a machine with its limits. Today, machines are much less limited, you know. I mean, the interesting thing is, you know, if we look at the history of the piano, so you have the original clavichord, and then you had the harpsichord that plucked, a funny sound. Then you had the clavichord, and then you had the pianoforte, which hit a note. None of it sounds like this. I mean, essentially what we're doing of any of this, if you play Bach or if you play Beethoven, this does not sound at all what it sounded like on Beethoven's piano. I've played one of them. It doesn't sound like this. It doesn't have these colors. Well, not whatsoever. Chopin's piano. Doesn't sound like this. This is far too rich. Chopin's piano had this airy, light, silvery tone. We try and create that on this instrument. We try and make it sound beautiful, but believe me, it sounds nothing like a real Pleyel in Chopin's day, which had this kind of mystical sound. So to answer your question, if these guys, these inventors would be around, I think they would tap you for every single thing that you could possibly give to them as an inventor to create new and more. You can't look at a guy like Debussy who changed the entire world of music and how color of sound is, and say, oh, he'd come to Google and say, oh, terrible people, they have digital sound, it's awful. You know, he'd want to know everything about how to use that sound, how to manipulate it in order to make color and make the world sound beautiful. You know, I think it's interesting. As a pianist who likes to deal with this and not play a keyboard, I don't like to play a keyboard, it has a lot to do with the sound that comes out, but also the immediacy. Because when I do this, it's an immediate action. You see, when I'm doing it digitally, what it has to go through is quite a bit different. And yet here you have the escapement, you have the push, you have the shove, you have the color, you have all these things, you have the string, so it's still a machine. But there seems to be one extra step that removes it from being slightly human, so to speak. So I don't know how they'd react to that. I personally find digital music and things that we can create and the kinds of colors of sound amazing. It's a staggering thing. What is confusing and complicated for me is taking a piece by Debussy that was intended for particular instruments, digitizing them as if that's the real thing. That's not the case. It's not the real thing. The real thing is essentially what he composed for, or it's a transcription. But it is very interesting to create new things with the real thing, with these instruments, with these wonderful digital colors that we can use. And people are doing it. They're doing it every day. The interesting thing for me is we're living in a time where there is so much sound, there is so much influence. What's sound that's going to be new? What is the sound to us that's going to be a sound that's going to be new, that we have never heard before? When are we going to hear a Debussy come up with something, you know, that sounds so romantic and so sensual? When are we going to hear that just moves us in that way? And what is it going to be based on? Is it going to be based on the notes that we know, 12-tone scales and so on and so forth? Or is it going to be based on something that we don't even know and hasn't yet been invented yet? What will the human ear tell us that is necessary as time goes on? We don't know. Another question. Yes? They have more tools, they invent less, and why do I think that? I don't think it's that they have more tools and they invent less, but if you look at the line of history, we can go all the way back to the very beginning, the Corelli and Rameau and all these types, and I mean, at the same time you have Bach, and then you have Beethoven, and then you have Brahms, and you have, well, you're looking at basically a straight line. Sometimes they cross. There's, you know, Chopin at a period and Liszt, and then Schubert just at the beginning, and then you look who comes next, you have a little bit somebody. But what are you looking? You count here, and you count here, you use your feet, and then you count maybe again here, 30, 40, 50. You're talking about tens of thousands of composers over years. And basically, my theory is time is the great decider of what's good and what's not. So thousands and thousands of composers have done this inventing, but only the great ones stayed. So when you ask, why are we seeing so many more tools and so much less invention? I don't believe we are. I only think we can know what invention is in 100 years from now. And perhaps somebody is composing in some room somewhere, doing something absolutely fascinating, but at the same time, we're not exposed to it yet. We don't know. In 100 years, hopefully, we will know what our great music is. And the truth is, we don't know now. Will it be Hamilton? I don't know, you know. Hamilton is a lot of stuff. I mean, I find it fascinating. It's a phenomenon, but it's a lot of stuff, admittedly, by the composer that is drawn from stuff that's immediately before it and is also quotations of immediately before it. It's not particularly new in that way. So all of this to say that we just don't know who's inventing. Somebody in this building could be inventing some kind of music in this, you know, that one day will be discovered and we will be able to see as being absolutely remarkable. We don't know yet. Just a couple more, yes?
What do you think about... Let's use the microphone.
Oh, okay, great.
What do you think about artificial intelligence creating music?
What do I think about art? Well, sometimes I wonder if I have artificial intelligence. What do I think about artificial intelligence creating music? The question to you is, because I don't know this, is artificial intelligence as smart as its creator or not? Does artificial intelligence actually have a life of its own? Or it doesn't have a life of its own? And to me, I don't know how artificial intelligence would have a sense of humanity beyond the creator behind it. So if that's the case, then why not just be human and create music? I'm not against artificial intelligence. I think it's a wonderful thing that needs to be controlled and managed by very smart people. Because ultimately, if we don't control something like that, it could get out of hand, as we know. So could that mean that all of a sudden we have great composers who are artificial intelligence? The only amount of artificial intelligence that could do that would be drawing on real intelligence that came before it. And so we'd probably only hear repetitious stuff. But how do I know? I don't know. It's not my field. But I'd like to believe that human beings still have, the height on that. Anyway, just one or two more, yes, and then I'll do some playing, yes.
So on Debussy in particular, did he view himself as a part of the avant-garde, or was he just a composer that critics didn't like?
Was he a part of the avant-garde or something that critics didn't like? I think Debussy viewed himself as an inventor. He viewed himself as somebody who wanted the old guard. He said this whole symphonic thing, this whole approach to music, it needs to end because it's boring, it's structured, it's full of rules, it's full of laws, and we're done with it, it's enough. And he wanted to invent something new. And that whole circle, the group of them, the poets, the symbolists, and so on, he looked to them for inspiration. It didn't come out of nowhere. Musically, coloristically, I think it came out of his mind. But in terms of the concept, of the cultural concept that's surrounding him, it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a whole group of people who were looking for new ways to tell stories. As he said, the world relied for far too long on the bloody Germans for the good music. It was time to change that. And that's exactly what he did. He changed it and he created what was a French color and a French sound. Listening to Debussy, he is as avant-garde as they go. There are crazy things that he does that even Ravel, totally different aesthetic and also a modernist in that way, didn't even begin to attempt what Debussy did. He really went as far as possible in terms of using emotional output to just create music. And I think he viewed himself as a new composer in a very classical sense, if that makes sense. Yes?
So if you think about Debussy, two things stand out to me. One is that the feedback loop, like the time between when he made something and when he got feedback on it, was quite long. And also the number of people that he would have had contact with was relatively limited. Tens of people in his circle, compared to today, a musician, not only do they have contact to billions of people, but when they put something out, they get feedback immediately. How do you think that impacts the creation process? And do you think that's pressuring music in a way that it wouldn't have been pressured in Debussy's time?
Well, in terms of that, I think nowadays it's a very complicated thing because people can become stars on YouTube or whatever else it is, or on American Idol or whatever chat show or so on and so forth, by not really having the lifetime of effort put into it. Because we look at it in a box. If that box kind of works for us, that's great. How many careers, potential great artists have been destroyed by getting there too early because they had pretty faces or because somehow they sounded good and they really weren't ready with all that work that needs to go in it to make it really great? Answer to that, I don't know. What would Debussy do? I think he'd be horrified, quite frankly, if he had to put something out there and not be able to go in and fix, not be able to go in and rework, not be able to go in and look how it went, not be able to struggle with it to make it really, truly great. Now, the great things are that we have tools to fix. We have auto-tuning, things. We have colors and sounds that we can cover all this kind of stuff. I think it's all part of the world, the way the world is going. But I think it's also very important not to forget the huge amounts of work that must go in to really creating something that is really great and will have staying power. Debussy understood that. Any great artist understands that. And I think all of you here understand that sitting in front of your computers doing your work. It doesn't just appear and, okay, you let it out to the world and it's fine and that's it. And, you know, you want to go back in, you want to make it better. You constantly want to push the envelope so that your output is as best as it can be. And I don't think there's any alternative to that. And I think they were just luckier in that they didn't have this kind of access. Going back to George Gershwin, who I mentioned, I think one of the big problems with him was he was a great composer, no doubt. He had very much to say. But he became famous so young. And he became so popular so young. And so he's now, and he said very early on, he said, I want to be famous, I want to be famous. So, you know, he composed things that made him famous. Would he have been a greater composer if there wasn't radio, you know? He was the one who basically was essentially one of the first to get his music played across, you know, the nation. So when you heard stuff like this, it wasn't United Airlines. You know, it was Gershwin playing 1927 Rudy Valley radio show and being heard, or WSJ or whatever it was in New York, being heard all over the country at once. That was the first time that such a thing could happen. Imagine. First time the entire country heard this together. Or, you know, when Kate Smith sang that, the whole country was able to hear it on the radio together. But 25 years before that, even 20 years before that, such a thing couldn't happen. You know, and so it was, as you say, limited. So the world has opened up to such a degree. The converse problem is that now everybody's a judge. Everybody's judge, jury, and everything. So you open up your stuff to the world and you can be finished in 2 seconds because too many people give the like or give the don't like or whatever it is. Does that make it good? Does that make it bad? Doesn't make it anything. It just makes the people sitting at the computer and this is what they push. You know, who gives it that much thought? There was thought. You know, then again, Debussy had terrible critics. I mean, they hated him. They said the worst things about him. So, is it any different? No. The people, and then it was printed in the newspaper, so everybody read in Paris that for the 200 people there at the concert, this was the worst experience ever. They said of his La Mer, I love this quote, they came, they were La Mer, the ocean. They came, they were expecting something huge, something big, something colossal, and all they got was a little agitated water in a bowl. So, you know, that then got quoted and that went all over the place and it got reprinted in newspaper to newspaper. It just took a little bit longer. But the truth is, I do believe that if it is great and that if it, above all, is human, that it will remain. Because that's the only thing that ties us and the world together. If we can connect to each other on some level and it makes us feel. If it doesn't make us feel, it's worthless. You know, I mean, do we say, you know, and a last one and then I'll play. Go ahead. Here we go. Yeah.
You mentioned Ravel a moment ago. Can you briefly compare Ravel and Debussy?
Yes, Ravel and Debussy are two very interesting characters, sort of crossing at the same time. Ravel lived longer, and Ravel was very elegant. You look at Ravel and you think there's a modern, elegant Frenchman, you know. You think the Belle Époque 20s, 30s, you know, hair slicked back, beautifully appointed, you know, so elegantly dressed. Debussy felt like he was a bit of a remnant from the late 1800s, and yet at the same time he was so modern. If you ask me, I think these aesthetics are completely different. Completely different. However, there are things that relate in each of them. They use similar colors. Ravel is considered a jewel worker. You know, he goes in there with his little tools and he corrects his diamond until it's 100% perfect. Debussy is a wild animal. Sometimes the music is just simple and it's expressive and so on. Ravel, it's in the construction, it's in the architecture, it's in the miracle of what that is. Debussy somehow, for me, I speak only for me, somehow is a much broader emotion. Ravel describes things musically, aesthetically, very elegantly. It's all proper. Debussy is slightly unhinged, you know, in all ways. It's a little bit more open. You know, Ravel uses many more notes than Debussy. He feels the need to. You know, lots of notes. Do you play? No. Oh, Ravel is just so many notes. Debussy uses a lot of notes. Ravel uses time 5. And you always wonder why he needs so many notes. Well, it's because that's how he accomplishes his goals. But it's really a fascinating thing to listen. Well, I'll bid you farewell with just a little Debussy piece. It's something that's so familiar. It's the thing that actually people say really changed piano music and so on and so forth. It's something I've loved. Very special piece, something that every kid plays. But it's amazing how he captured what he captured in it. you.